Well, I'm very happy to welcome New South Wales 46th Premier and New South Wales youngest Premier, Dominic Perrottet, to Macquarie Street Matters. Welcome, Dom.
Thanks, Alistair. I mean, I've always wanted to go on Macquarie Street Matters. I mean, this is the highlight of my political career.
I feel like
I've been waiting for this moment. Why have you never asked me to come on?
I feel like David Frost had an easier time getting Richard Nixon to do an interview than Macquarie Street Matters has, but finally you've come on, and I'm so grateful that you're giving us your time today on what is actually a pretty important day for you personally, because it's actually the day that you're about to resign from Parliament.
That's right. I've written the letter. I'll be finishing Macquarie Street Matters and going down and resigning.
Now, Dom, what I want to talk to you about are a three Ps. I want to talk to you about policy, politics, and the personal.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I'd start with policy because that's something that I know you've been incredibly passionate about in your career in politics. Let's start with you as Treasurer. You delivered 5 budgets.
Mm-hmm.
As Treasurer, you have a huge influence over the policy direction of government.
Yep.
What are the favourite policies that you're actually able to bring forward as Treasurer of New South Wales?
Well, probably one of the major reforms we did was actually not just focused on New South Wales, was the establishment of the Board of State Treasurers. And it was pretty clear to me early on when I became Treasurer that really the Treasurers were just passengers on whatever the Commonwealth Government were doing, and also that the Treasurer just get picked off. And there was no capacity to actually drive an agenda from the states. It was all in response to what was coming out of Canberra. So we had a Liberal government at the time. So I spoke to
Liberal federal government.
Liberal federal government at the time, and I spoke to the state treasurers. I think majority of which were Labor. I think Tasmania might have been a Liberal government, but the rest were Labor governments. And it was probably only a Liberal who could have done it at that point in time, because otherwise it would have looked like politics. And the feds weren't very happy with this new concept. But it really started to change the way those COAG meetings, were run, and ultimately we were able to get unity amongst the state treasurers prior to COAG meetings. So it wasn't just, what's our position going into the meeting? It was actually well in advance of the meetings. We would get our items onto the agenda that we could find common ground on. And so I think that was a really big change to how the states and territories engage with the federal government. And obviously that led to the no worse off clause coming in, and a whole range of other matters I think that really assisted us in terms of sharing information between the public service and ministers.
Dom, this is part of a bigger problem, not just in terms of treasurers, but indeed in terms of Commonwealth-state relations.
Yep.
And that is that when there are meetings of ministers in any area of government, between the federal and the state ministers, the Commonwealth tends to drive those meetings. As a state minister, you get typically an agenda at the last minute.
Yeah.
You get inadequate time to get proper advice. The Commonwealth drives the whole thing.
It's become a form to co-opt the states onto their agenda. It's not the national government, it's the federal government, and the federal government needs to take their role as, yes, they're the lead, but ultimately all the states and territories are an essential core part of a functioning democracy here in Australia. So I think that change, and hopefully a shift in culture over time, will make a real difference to the Federation.
I wasn't going to go to federal-state relations so quickly.
Well, let's go to
But you've taken me there. Can I just say, I remember when you were Premier telling me about this idea that we needed to coordinate all the state elections with the federal election, a little bit like they do in the United States, where they have 2-year cycles, 4-year cycles for the presidency. And I remember, can I be honest, at the time, I remember thinking, this is a bit of a wacky idea and we'll never be able to do it. But actually, the more I reflected on it, and you raised it in your valedictory speech, the more, particularly having regard to this problem of coordination of the states and the federal government, the more I think it's a good idea. So the essential problem is that states find it difficult to formulate relationship with other state counterparts because you've got different electoral cycles in all our different states. And then on top of that, you've got a federal electoral cycle, which is different again. And so you've got this revolving door of people coming in and out of ministries, never actually able to work together because none of them are really in their particular portfolios for any period of time to form relationships. Your idea of the Board of Treasurers was actually to get the treasurers working together. But as I said, that's part of a bigger problem, which is that there is no coordination between our governments. I mean, the people of Australia want us to work together. Yeah. This is not something that was thought of at Federation, but as I understand your idea, it's to have the federal election on 4-year cycles, and then 2 years within that federal cycle, you would have all the state governments having a state election for 4 years, so that you get a degree of continuity between the states and the federal government. Do you think we could ever do that? It sounds like a good idea to me.
Well, how hard could it be? I mean, this is just, I think it makes a lot of sense to do it. I accept the point you don't want them all on the same day because, the same date as the federal election, because you don't want states to get caught up in the wash, right? So having it at the midpoint and also giving the flexibility for the states and territories to go within 6 months of that midpoint ensures greater continuity on those bodies to drive reform. And I think it wouldn't be too hard for the federal government to say, well, from this date we're going to go to 4-year fixed terms, and here's the federal election date, and then ultimately the states and territories just align. Now that means you might have to align over a cycle, a 4-year cycle, so you just shift the date out. So obviously for, in New South Wales, for example, you might have a longer term in that last instance, or a shorter term to kind of align the dates up. But it can't be that difficult. I think there's a lot of benefit for our country and our people in doing it. And you will get a much greater connection between senior ministers, well, the treasurers particularly, and the premiers across the country working together over a longer period of time, rather than having, as you would have experienced yourself, ministers cycling in and out of those forums. Now, I was fortunate as treasurer to have a very good working relationship with Tim Pallas, and we were there together. He was there before me, and he's still there, and we were there for 5 years and worked very closely together over that period of time. But I think that's something that we should look at.
I think two things. First of all, it could be done probably with a referendum, a constitutional referendum at a federal level, that would somehow empower the federal constitution to determine the timing of state elections, a bit like they have in the US in terms of Congress and the presidency. But the other thing that it struck me about the idea is that there are so many things that are wrong with our federation, and you referred to some of these in your valedictory speech. Yet the only talk of any constitutional change at a federal level seems to be changing the head of state. Do you think it's time that we actually had a constitutional convention that was focused on interstate relations between the Commonwealth and the state to deal with some of the really sticky problems that have been going on?
That's a good idea. I don't think we need a federal constitutional convention to determine that it's a good idea to have a greater alignment on the dates. Now, it's pretty dry, so I think the public would ultimately support it. And if you had both sides of politics coming together, then and saying this is a good idea and here's what we can achieve by doing it. But in terms of the other issues you raised, like I spoke in my valedictory speech about healthcare, and it's one of these issues that it's just over time different systems have evolved, and we now have a situation where they don't work alongside each other; they actively work against each other. And these are some of the challenges that I think if you had the right minds around the table, you could come out with some really good ideas. Otherwise, and these things take time, but politics has become so focused on the short term. And so saying that, and if you're going to change the dates or anything like this, it's probably not going to happen for 6 to 8 years to get full alignment, right? But that doesn't mean you make the decision now because we're going to get there in some time.
I suppose I wasn't so much saying that you need a constitutional convention to change the dates.
You're talking about the issues.
I'm just talking about the federal state issues. It seems to me that there's a whole suite of issues. I mean, to take your point about health, here we have a massive federal health bureaucracy, but they don't run a hospital.
Yep.
We've got a massive federal education bureaucracy, but they don't run a school. There are a whole lot of problems of waste of what are becoming more and more scarce resources through having this federal
and also
structure not working as optimally as it could.
And also service delivery. I mean, the inclination of the federal government to get involved in nationwide service delivery when you've got so many diverse states, is just wrong. And it's the states and the territories that are the service delivery arms of government. And I'll have no issue with the federal government having national policy. That's completely fine. But then pay for it and allow the states to roll it out in the way that works for them. And you know this, I mean, every state is different. And that obviously comes down to the GST formula as well, and the way they look at all the calculations, the remoteness, different levels, different levels of socioeconomic status that occur in different states, and housing issues and all of that. So no state is the same, but ultimately you can't have a one-size-fits-all policy, which is generally what happens when the federal government gets involved in service delivery.
I was going to some of your policy triumphs as a politician.
There were some failures as well.
Well, we don't need to dwell on those, unless you want to. Let's go back to your early days as a minister. You were finance minister. You really drove the initial stages of Service New South Wales, talking about service delivery.
Yeah.
That was back prior to the 2015 election that you started that process. Here we are in 2024. We still have terrible federal service delivery.
That's a great case study. I mean, the federal government, look at Service Australia compared to Service New South Wales. And I spoke back then, about the time, it was still really difficult to get that up. I mean, the amount of pushback on people not wanting to close motor registries was insane. I mean, I was in disbelief in relation to, and this gives you an example of how hard policy change can be. I mean, if you can't get rid of motor registries and go from situations to rock up and the bulletproof glass was there, you take a day off work, hit that old
hours and hours
crappy machine.
Young people don't realise how many
ticket.
Hours you used to have to spend at those motor registries.
You'd sit there reading half a novel.
You had to take a book and a cut lunch.
Yeah. And then you go up and
hours.
Someone would growl at you from behind the screen. You got the wrong ticket. You have to go back, get another ticket, sit down. And it was terrible. And then we tried to we did digital driver's licenses, even that. I mean, I remember when speaking to Mike Baird and we had this idea of doing digital driver's license, and he supported the idea. It was in the 2015 election campaign. I was on Talkback Radio, and some of the questions that you get, I mean, it was amazing. Like, there were things like, well, what happens if the police pull you over and your phone's gone dead? And you'd be sitting there going, I don't know. What happens if the police pull you over and you've lost your wallet or you left it at home? Like, but that's the challenge in change. But ultimately, we've now got 80% of adults in New South Wales have a digital driver's license.
Yes.
80%.
Dom, just going back to Service New South Wales, and you said some things about the public service in your valedictory speech. One of the things I remember you telling me about Service for New South Wales and the evolution of Service for New South Wales is the public service satisfaction rate from working in a well-run organisation like Service for New South Wales compared to running in a badly run organisation like those old motor registry offices. It actually makes the staff happier. They get enjoyment out of their work when you actually provide well-run government services.
Well, they had the whole system was set up to have much greater engagement with the frontline workers, and they had a thing called Circle of Service and their rewards, and they took a lot of pride in their work. And ultimately, government is about service, and customer service is on the very forefront of it. And if my approach with Service New South Wales was, this is probably one platforms that every single person in New South Wales has interaction with. And if that is your interaction with government and it's a negative one, well, what does that say about everything else that's going on? And so it was really important, and that's why we had the concierges meet you at the front, to really shift this thing that what can we do to help you and how can we make your life easier? But once again, that was difficult in terms of also trying to get from within the public service. When I was finance minister, the agencies right across government rolling their services into Service New South Wales. And I'm having numerous conversations at the time with them because everyone was like, well, we're different, we're special. But that kind of provides like a siloed mentality. And ultimately, it's not about what was good for a certain agency, it's about what's good for the citizen. And if you put the person at the centre and you build everything around that, then ultimately you get the best outcome. And that's I believe, what we achieved with Service New South Wales.
Now, Service for New South Wales is a great example of government doesn't have to be inefficient and poor. It can actually be better than the private sector if done properly.
Yeah.
You had as Treasurer...
By the way, that's what happened with Service New South Wales.
Yes.
It's a rare moment. We had the private sector coming to us to learn customer service. And what a success story that is. I mean, I'm about to go to the US where you line up outside the DMV every day, right? So we were able to be not just fast followers of the private sector, but leaders.
One of your achievements as Treasurer was that you were convinced that government needs to be smaller and more efficient. And you did that by a strong commitment to actually driving efficiency in the public service and reducing state taxes. Tell us a bit about that and the achievements that you feel.
Well, we had in every budget, well, probably wasn't every single one, but it was always a focus, and I think probably in 3 of the 5. But we moved, if we're taking about taxes, we moved the payroll tax threshold from 750,000 to 1.2 million. And we actually had... that actually resulted in more revenue coming in. And why? Because lowering taxes gives business the ability to flourish, to invest, and ultimately do better. And when they're doing better, the economy is more strong. And ultimately, what's downstream from that? The state's budget, and that allows us to invest more into services. So there's always this temptation, I think particularly as a treasurer, well, I'll increase this tax and I'll increase this tax because I'm focused on the budgets. Like I put a lot of work when I was treasurer. After about a couple of years, it became pretty clear to me that there was, yes, a strong focus on the budget, and that's important, but not so strong on the economic side of things. And that's why I appointed our first chief economist, our first productivity commissioner, and ultimately as well Global New South Wales, because our trade offices overseas and our engagement compared to other states was incredibly poor, and we were just simply relying on, when people think of Australia, they think of the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House in Sydney, but we weren't at the back of the room, we were actually out of the room. And so having Treasury think about in the day-to-day, well, yes, obviously the budget's important, but the budget's going to be stronger if our economy is strong too. And so that was a major push of mine.
And this is a fundamental distinction between the way in which the coalition sees government and politics to the way that the Labor Party sees politics. The coalition believes that if you grow the economic pie, there'll be more for everyone.
Yeah.
Whereas Labor doesn't focus on growing the pie, they just want to cut it up in more pieces, which ultimately tends to shrink the pie.
History shows you this. Ronald Reagan made a number of tax cuts in that time. We used to have debates in question time here, and they'd say, "Oh, you're receiving more tax revenue." Yes, but the tax rates were lower. You lower the tax rates. We also, as Treasurer, we index the stamp duty thresholds as well, because it hadn't been changed.
Yes.
That's how stamp duty's become this massive problem, because over time, you just paid more and more tax. And ultimately, it's become an impediment for so many people reaching the great Australian dream.
And so just so that our listeners understand the context in which you're talking, you've talked about effectively lowering payroll tax by increasing the threshold, and you've talked about lowering stamp duty. The Thodey review, which you commissioned, made it clear that the two biggest independent sources of revenue to a state government are payroll tax and stamp duty. So you were actually cutting at the heart of the tax revenue that was coming to you as Treasurer by doing those measures, but you were doing it with a view to growing the economy of New South Wales.
And giving people greater freedom to make the decisions that they want to. Go back to Reagan. Reagan said, "Starve the beast." you know, and if you give people more of their own, you give people, it's not the government's money, it's people's money, it's small businesses' money. They earn it, and governments need to be very careful with how they spend it.
Now, one of your initiatives also as Treasurer was on a humanitarian medical topic, was to massively increase the funding for palliative care in New South Wales. What motivated you in that direction?
Well, we did that twice. I did a package as Treasurer. That was the first instance because I had numerous conversations, and ultimately it's an area in health that had not been funded. And I actually went to health during that budget and said, it was right near the end of the budget process, and I said, right, I can't remember what the dollar figure was back then today, but I said, I'm going to give you an extra X amount of money outside of your growth rate to invest in palliative care. And they came back and said, oh, we'll take the money, but we just won't put it into palliative care. Right, I said, that's okay. Well, if you're not going to put in palliative care, I'll give it to Rob Stokes in education. And we'll do, and I've got a couple of other ideas that I wanted to pursue down that path. Obviously, they ultimately came back and said, no, we'll put in the money into palliative care. I don't know what their aversion was, but ultimately the stories that I'd heard, and they had great engagement actually with many members of Parliament right across the spectrum. And ultimately, when you're talking about some of the most vulnerable situations that people go through, and we're all going to go through that in our time, that care and support is there. And then ultimately, as Premier, when the voluntary assisted dying bill came through, you know, many of the people, when I, you know, was hearing the stories or the arguments that were being made, many of the arguments being made were these horrific stories about people coming to the end of their life and just not having that care and support. So obviously I was against that bill, but ultimately my position was that if this is going to be legal, and I think that's the way it was looking, well, ultimately it should be a last resort, not a first resort. And we put another significant investment in there that I think would get us to the point where every single person in this state is given the best care possible as they come to the end of their life.
Dom, when you became Premier, it was in difficult circumstances, and I might talk about that in the politics section, but you tried to define your premiership by having new ideas that would give effectively a fresh start to what was a 10.5-year or more government at the time that you took over. Do you want to go through some of those policy initiatives that you thought of which were fresh and new ideas?
Well, stamp duty was the first one, right? Because I'd already done a lot of work on that when I was Treasurer, and I think in the last budget, it might have been, we had the discussion, we issued a discussion paper for that reform. And I learned a lot during that period of time. We held many meetings with different stakeholders, retirees, first home buyers, renters, self-funded retirees, and tested. What you're doing is looking at, well, here's what I'd like to do. What do you think? And we discussed the pros and the cons, and it really gave me an insight into how people would look at this issue. Because it's obviously, for many, it's a major change.
So this was a change from a lump sum stamp duty, one-off, in New South Wales now around $80,000 on an average purchase, to people being able to pay that off over a period of time.
Yeah. Well, the biggest
annually.
Yeah. And the biggest concern was in those groups were elderly people thinking that this was going to apply to them, even though they paid stamp duty. Yeah. But I can tell you from the numerous forums that we had, young people were completely in favour of it.
But even with seniors, Dom, the fact of the matter is, one of the major disincentives to downsizing for someone who's an empty nester is the fact that you've then got to pay $60,000 in stamp duty.
And that was going to be the next cab off the rank. So you might recall, so we had this in place at the start, and then in the election campaign, we committed to giving first home buyers that choice for life. So if they'd come into that scheme and hadn't paid stamp duty on the first one, they could have that choice for the rest of their life. The next one we would have rolled out would have been for downsizers, to give them that opportunity, because it is an impediment.
It was incredibly popular amongst young people, as you said.
It was.
And there was a huge take-up.
Yep.
Are you disappointed that Chris Minns just abolished it outright?
Well, I think our system's much better. And we had those programs in, the current one, right, that's in place. It's not doing anything to drive productivity.
Was that just politics by him? Just saying,
it's not a matter.
I can't have a coalition initiative there being successful?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that the policy we had was going to, over time, normalise a system in a way that was better for everyone, and ultimately would result in greater economic growth, greater productivity, and ultimately drive home ownership rates across the state.
I mean, the American Revolution was over stamp duty. You gave the example in your valedictory speech that, could you imagine if stamp duty was just a small administrative fee and someone said to turn it into what it's become now?
Everyone says, people say at the time, it's a tax on the family home. Well, there is a tax on the family home right now. It's called stamp duty. We pay council rates.
Yes.
So you're moving to a system where you're paying council rates, not a huge lump sum cost. But you've got to do things slowly, because I think people think the worst. And unfortunately, trust in politicians is declining. And so that probably leads to, in many ways, the status quo reigning supreme. Because I think a lot of people look at what's the other agenda, rather than saying, no, that the agenda here is to look after you. The agenda here is to give you greater opportunity in life. And I think trust in politics is something that has become a real problem. Most people are probably reluctant to vote Labor or Liberal, rather than going out there on the day and saying, I passionately believe that this is the party I want to support today.
One of the other big policy areas you had was reforming education. To what extent is that driven by your life experience of having a big family? Obviously, education is an important issue in your family. You yourself were an outstanding student. You take education seriously. What was your thinking around those education reforms?
On education, I make this point. There can be no excuse for the poor outcomes we are having in education levels for our children, because never before, and we were the first government, I think, to sign up to the Gonski changes. Never before has there been as much investment as a percentage of GDP that is going into education, not just in New South Wales, right across the country. So the more investment we're making, the worse our educational outcomes are. So people will always say, and the Teachers Federation are always going to argue the case, that's all about money, we need more money. It's not. It's about getting into the heart of appreciating, understanding why it is that our children are not having the same results that we're seeing around the world. And I know that Labor were certainly saying this when they were in opposition, but I think they fundamentally need to understand that it's not about the money. It's about making some really difficult decisions in there. Now, we had some on teaching, in terms of attracting teachers from the outside the profession to see it as because it is a vocational profession. Rewarding excellence in education and setting up in schools, giving schools the flexibility to say, okay, here's what we don't have, and they could pay a higher amount for a teacher in that area. Financial literacy was something I was really passionate about, and as Treasurer, we set up a program to do that. We would have rolled that out more fully post the election, like why our children are leaving school not understanding what I think is pretty basic information about credit cards, mortgages, shares, the financial tools they need, even from basic savings, to set them up for success and grow their wealth over time. society is changing so much and being disrupted. Even from when I left school in 2000 to where it is today, we're in an incredibly different place. Now, that was well after you left school, Alistair.
Just a little bit.
but you know, I look at what my kids are learning in terms of coding and things like that. I've got no idea what they're doing, but you know, it's different, right? But how, if we're looking at a modern world, what are the skill sets they're going to need to succeed? And how do we tailor the education system to focus on giving our kids that opportunity? And in some ways, it's getting back to basics. There are always things like English and literature and mathematics and science that are core. But just like everything else, these other courses just build up, and really they're just kind of white noise that's a distraction away from core principles. And then adding on to that, you know, where are the changes that are happening in society, and what can we do to help our kids succeed?
I mean, what is so different is that the rate of technological change was sufficiently slow that you didn't need to dramatically change your education system to meet what were the skills that would be required in the workforce.
Yes.
But it seems to me that now what we need to do, as you've just said, is actually look at what are the skills that are going to be required in the workforce in 10 years' time, and then work backwards and say, well, what are we giving them those skills in our education system? I don't think we are. You know, as Minister for Science, Innovation and Technology, the first Minister for Science in New South Wales that you made me, it became quite clear that we aren't actually doing that. We're hearing, you know, university lecturers in mathematics say that the level of mathematics has declined dramatically within their working
but it's hard,
lifetime.
This takes critical thinking and effort. It's lazy policy to just talk about dollars. I mean, that's just budget cycle going into the Treasurer and saying, look, our education marks now, we need this and we need that. Okay, but let's go behind it. What's actually going on? And that means you've got to have a frank assessment, just like we all do in our lives, about what am I not doing well? Where are the areas of improvement? How can I be the best person that I can be? Well, how do we ensure we have the best education system? And you can't do that if you're not actually accepting what's going wrong. And that takes self-reflection, and ultimately that's where you're going to get better outcomes. And it's going to be difficult on the way through, but ultimately that's where we need to get to.
I mean, I assume that we will have some revolutionary moment in education curriculum at some time in the near future that will kind of deal with these issues.
But look at AI. I mean, AI is going to change. I mean, the pace of technological change under AI compared to the internet is significant.
Yes. Right.
So our kids are going to be in a very, very different world. I think their employment, the way their employment opportunities, I think we're going to be, you know, my father had the same job pretty much for his entire career. I think that is, and there's still people that obviously do that, but I think that's going to be so rare in the next 30, 40 years.
Dom, your eye to the future and your eye to the financial future of our next generation caused you to come up with a policy idea which you took to the election on a kids' future fund.
Yeah.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, this is an idea we had for a few years, and the pandemic kind of got in the way of it, to be frank. So, and stamp duty was the number one thing. So we kind of tinkered away at this for some time, whilst never launching it. And then obviously, as Premier, we had a pretty big budget. I'd made the judgment call that this will be something that we take to the election. The focus there was always, you know, Paul Keating, you know, obviously brought in superannuation, which I think has been a great thing. And the reason I know there's a lot of people on my side in the Liberal Party who disagree with superannuation and believe that people should be able to access it for buying homes and things like that. Well, there's a reason why you shouldn't. I mean, ultimately, the burden on I'd love to see some numbers in relation to the impact on the aged pension, where we would have been but for superannuation,
particularly with the baby boomer generation retiring.
Absolutely. The thinking was, well, why can't we have something like that for our children, so when they leave school, they're in a much better financial position to either invest in education, so they're not lumbered with a huge HECS debt, or in the alternative, given the issues we're facing today, housing. And the other idea behind it was to obviously, as a parent, you're so busy with the day-to-day and just getting through life, that having the government kind of be there to encourage parents to save for their children's future, I think would have really helped. And it would also help our young people as they were going through school to think about it too.
That was one of the aspects I really liked about it, was not only that it was so future focused, but effectively you were giving average people in the community the benefit of sophisticated investment advice and a tax-effective structure to be able to invest in their kids' future. Very wealthy people have that benefit. Average people don't have the benefit of that sort of advice. And you are effectively doing what governments are able to do, which is to scale benefits to the population by putting in place that structure.
Well, there were criticisms about saying, oh, well, everybody gets access to it. And it's like, oh, well, poorer kids aren't going to get the same leg up as us. Well, the way we structured it, everybody would have been better off. Everyone would have been better off. And that just shows you once again change, how hard it is. Because, so, all right, well, let's not do anything about it. Let's just have the current situation in place. This would have given younger people, and the reality is the majority of wealthy people who have means wouldn't have taken it up. But I know who would have, and that's people who don't have that means and would have found a way, because everybody wants to make sure their child has the very, very best.
So, Dom, the final thing that I wanted to talk about was vouchers.
Yep.
We had an emerging problem with cost of living coming out of the COVID pandemic. People had a whole lot of cash saved. People were coming off fixed interest mortgages, and there was a degree of inflation within the economy that was making it difficult for families. Your response to that had started a few years earlier with active kids vouchers, which then created into creative kids vouchers, which turned into First Lab vouchers, and then back to school vouchers ultimately as Premier. What role do you think that these vouchers have in terms of good state government?
I think they're incredibly important. And like a lot of people on our side just don't think, they disagree with what they would claim to be middle class welfare, right? And I think John Howard rallied against this. I've always just taken the view in my mind that, and I said in my speech the other night, that wealth is not that income's not the sole determinant of wealth, right? And that the middle class generally are out there working hard, paying their taxes and not getting much in return. But also, I know that from speaking to mums, in fact, the whole concept kind of started with a lunch I was at. And I was sitting next to someone from Queensland who she was part of some Learn to Swim. Or no, it wasn't Learn to Swim. It was more some life-saving kind of, surf life-saving kind of organisation. And she was taking me through there's a real problem now that if you look at the kids who are learning to swim, the numbers are declining, and then the drownings are increasing. It was one of those meetings, I don't remember, not meeting, I was just sitting at a lunch, I walked over and said, we should do something about this, right? And then that kind of merged into the mums and dads conversation. So I was like, well, hold on. We could do something like this, which would encourage parents who are doing it tough, ease the burden, and get their kids into playing sport. And the health outcomes would be significant as well, but just the cultural outcome. Like getting kids playing with other children on Saturdays and weekday nights. And it is a massive cost. It is a massive cost. Once you pay the registration, once you pay for the uniforms, now obviously different schools have different arrangements, different clubs, everyone's trying to help, right? But ultimately, I think the numbers speak for themselves. The take-up rates.
As sports minister, it was incredible. We were spending on our sports vouchers. It's easily the most successful grassroots sporting program in Australia's history.
Yeah.
We were spending 4 or 5 times more a year than Victoria was on their voucher system, which just goes to show the take-up, as you say.
Well, the take-up was significant, and that's why when it works, we doubled it, right? We doubled it, so you'd have one semester and another sport in the second semester.
And wherever you went in the state as sports minister, particularly in the less well-off areas, they would rave about the active kids.
The enrolments
vouchers.
went up.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, that's a nice help. because families struggling to make ends meet, and that helps. The enrolments in sport went drastically up. I mean, it was a great program where you've been able to help people, and there are so many children who are probably playing sport today that never would, but for that program. That was in my first budget.
Well, Dom, there's still a lot more policy stuff that we can talk about. So let's leave that to next week's episode, where we can also talk more about personal and the politics as well as policy.